Wonderful to see such a great turnout tonight. My name is Sherry Litwack, and I am delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation. This presentation by Professor Daniel Shealy is part of the library's 150th anniversary celebration. Please check out the library's website for other programs and mark your calendars for the big anniversary celebration on October 1st. I encourage you to see the exhibition at the Concord Museum, A Perpetual Invitation, 150 Years of Art at the Concord Free Public Library, which will be there through September 4th. And May Alcott is one of the featured artists. And then be sure to come back to the library to see the art back home. I would also encourage you to visit Orchard House to see May Alcott's drawings literally on the walls. After tonight's lecture, you will have a greater appreciation for the influence that Concord had on May's art. Professor Shealy will also be revealing an important recent acquisition related to May. After the program, I will be making an exciting announcement. It is now my pleasure to introduce Anka Voss, the curator of the William Monroe Special Collections.
Thank you, Sherry, very much. Good evening. Again, my name is Anka Voss, and I'm the curator of the William Monroe Special Collections here at the Concord Free Public Library, and I'm so pleased that you are here this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Daniel Shealy. Daniel Shealy is a professor of English at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, where he teaches American literature. He has published 13 books on Louisa May Alcott, including Editing Little Women Abroad, the Alcott Sisters' Letters from Europe, 1870 to 71, a work that chronicles May Alcott's first trip to Europe. His most recent book is Little Women at 150, a collection of essays published in 2022. Tonight's presentation by Professor Shealy will draw from his essay, Concordia's Queen, May Alcott and the Town of Concord, which was published in 2022 in another selection of essays, The Forgotten Alcott, Essays on the Artistic Legacy and Literary Life of May Alcott. In addition, Professor Shealy will cite a letter dated circa 1868 from Louisa May Alcott to her publisher, Thomas Niles of Roberts Brothers, making editorial notes about the publication of Little Women. This important letter, acquired recently by the William Monroe Special Collections, thanks to several generous donors, is on view here in the Goodwin Forum, and there's also additional material on view, exhibit items, as you walk outside the forum. Again, those items are related to Professor Shealy's talks today. Welcome. Professor Shealy, we're so pleased you can be with us here today.
First of all, it's really an honor to be here tonight. I want to thank Anka and Special Collections for inviting me. I also want to thank the library and the corporation for all the support that they show, Special Collections and the library in general. I've spoken all over the country to all sorts of different audiences, and I must say, and this is really true, there's no place that I like to speak better than Concord, Massachusetts. It does my heart really, really, well to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to this audience. So thank you. I'm very appreciative of this. In 1878, May Alcott, newly married and now living outside of Paris, France, wrote home to her famous literary sister, Louisa May Alcott, saying, "Nothing would ever induce me to live in Concord again. Burdened with care after this taste of all life can be. If woman wants a new lease on life, let her come here. This foreign life is so satisfactory, so full of the picturesque, so independent and charming that Concord or Boston would seem like a prison to me. Strong words. Europe allowed May Alcott to live the existence she had always dreamed of, an artistic life filled with sketching, painting, music, and family. It was indeed a new beginning, a chance to cast off the old customs and habits of the United States. Perhaps it was not the town of Concord, Massachusetts itself that May Alcott disliked, but the fact that it held family obligations and memories that made her feel, quote, burdened with care. Perhaps Concord, more than any other place, helped to form May Alcott, both as an individual and as an artist. It's well known that Concord was not the definitive setting of Louisa May Alcott's childhood, given the family moved numerous times over 20 years in the 1840s and 1850s. However, it proved to be a formative influence on May's life. Even though Concord held firm to its agrarian roots, by the end of the 1850s, it was a progressive town in many ways, but one that was increasingly becoming a suburb of Boston. May would spend a few years of her childhood in this small town of just over 2,000 people, moving away to Boston when she was 9, but returning by her late teens. In Concord, May would grow into adulthood as an independent individual. Her family, one of the more progressive perhaps in the village, valued education, philosophy, literature, music, and art, as did their circle of friends. May clearly absorbed this creative life. Both of her parents, Bronson and Abigail, as well as many of their close friends, publicly supported abolitionism and women's rights. Surrounded by such reform-minded individuals, May would never lose the desire to see the possibility of a better life, not only for herself, but also for others. These fundamental qualities, I think, became part of May herself. By examining May's life in Concord, one sees that education, work, even courtship, during the Civil War, and also the transatlantic exchange, all played into her maturation as a self-reliant woman. Underlying all of these influences would be her commitment to art. Nurtured from childhood onward, art was May's North Star. Concord would always be a part of May Alcott, and it would give her a grounding of place that her 3 older sisters may have lacked because of the misfortunes of the impecunious family. In February 1862, May, writing in Concord, would confide in her journal that she wished she would be able to always, quote, call this dear old place home. I hope for a more beautiful one we never had. And it was May who, according to her sisters and friend, made Orchard House, the Alcott family, and even Concord itself, burst with life and beauty. However, that energy and atmosphere would disappear when May moved to Europe in the late 1870s. Passing by the now vacant Orchard House in the spring of 1879, Louisa would look up at May's bedroom window with green vines clustered round it and think, no golden-haired, blue-gowned Diana ever appears now. Almost 2 decades earlier, though, May Alcott, the golden-haired enchantress of the hunt, had roamed the fields and forests of Concordia. Born on July 26, 1840, the 4th Alcott daughter, Abigail May, named for her mother and often called Abby May or Ab or Abby in her youth, so you'll hear me refer to her a number of times by those names tonight. She was the only Alcott actually born in Concord. The new baby was seen as a special child in the impoverished family, and Bronson Alcott proudly announced in his journal, "A new life has arrived to us. She was born with the dawn and is a proud little queen, not deigning to give us the light of her royal presence, but persist in sleeping all the time without notice of the world of ourselves." Not quite 3 years old when Bronson, in June 1843, moved his young family to Fruitlands, where he and his British friend Charles Lane established their failed experiments in communal living, May Alcott was too young to remember the 7 months of hardship endured there. After boarding with the Lovejoys in nearby Steel River for most of 1844, the Alcotts returned to Concord in November, where they stayed with Edmund Hosmer's family until they moved into the 150-year-old Horatio Cogswell house on Lexington Road in April 1845. Purchased with an inheritance from the estate of Colonel Joseph May, Abigail Alcott's father, Hillside, as the Alcotts call the home, would be the first house that the family actually owned. Unfortunately, they would live there only a little over 3.5 years. However, these also proved difficult years for the impoverished family, as Bronson Alcott was still unable to find employment as a teacher. While the brief sojourn at Hillside became literary fodder for Louisa May Alcott almost 2 decades later, when she recreated her adolescent experiences in Little Women, these early Concord years were not as significant for May, perhaps, who was only 9 years old when the family, in November 1849, moved to Boston and to an even more impoverished life. 8 years later, in the autumn of 1857, the Alcotts were looking to return to Concord. However, Anna, the oldest sister, wrote her father, insisting that May wanted him to, quote, "by all means find a house in or near Boston within walking distance, as her drawing and music are the only friends she cares for, that this winter is of the utmost importance to her. She is willing to be guided, but can't give up drawing." Well, you know how the story ends up. Bronson desired to be near his close friend Ralph Waldo Emerson in Concord. And in September 1858, he purchased the John Moore property next door to their former home, Hillside. $945, right? Good purchase. With a 10-acre parcel of woods and several dozen apple trees surrounding the old homestead, Bronson aptly named his new abode Orchard House. As soon as the Alcotts moved into their new Concord home, less than a quarter of a mile from Emerson's house, I'm not so sure he felt great about that, May Alcott began to make the place her own. If one goes to Orchard House today, what surprises most first-time visitors, I think, is the evidence of May Alcott's talent. I can recall the first time I went there, it was the biggest impression that I had leaving Orchard House. Right? May's presence literally jumps off the walls. Her original artwork decorates many of the rooms. Here is her early studio with plaster cast of hands. Here, hanging on the walls, are her sketches and paintings, copies of J.M.W. Turner's works that she had completed in London in the 1870s. And you'll notice, if you haven't, 3 examples hanging on the wall here. Also, there is her copy of Endymion, made in 1859. Also at Orchard House sits the fireboard with the Alcott coat of arms and the breadboard with the head of Raphael, examples of May's pyrography. But what appears especially appealing and somewhat startling is her bedroom. It startled me too. The small blue room, right, at the head of the stairs. Here, the room serves as her ready-made canvas for the emergence of her artistic sensibilities. As Edward Emerson, son of Ralph Waldo Emerson, recalled, "On the plaster and paint, she gives her pencil and brush all the liberty they cried for. as the artistic craving of her nature was now asserting itself. Outlined in pencil, pen, and paint on the walls and window frames are images from mythology, primarily figures May traced and copied from John Flaxman's illustrations for the Iliad and Odyssey. And do make sure you take a look at the display case out in the hallway there, because you'll see the copy of Flaxman's volume and also some examples of May's work there. Flaxman was a British sculptor and draftsman, and he had garnered his early fame by illustrating scenes from great works of literature. Obviously, May Alcott was transfixed by his neoclassical art as she copied Flaxman's Juno and Minerva, assisting the Greeks, and the council of Jupiter, Minerva, and Mercury onto the walls of her room. The budding young artist also decorated doors, lettered mantels, and painted panels with nature scenes in color. In fact, Orchard House itself is a tangible expression of May's creative vitality and development. But after all, Orchard House was more May's home than the other sisters. Elizabeth died just months before the Alcott family moved into the house in the summer of 1858. Anna, the oldest sister, lived there only 2 years before she married John Bridge Pratt in 1860 and established her own home outside of Boston. Louisa May was already 26 years old when the family moved there, and she was working at various jobs as well as beginning her publishing career in earnest. So she was often away in the city for stretches at a time. But May Alcott was only 17 when the family arrived back in town, and she fit right into the young social scene of Concord, what she and her sisters would call our set. Julian Hawthorne, the son of Nathaniel and Sophia Hawthorne, and 6 years May's junior, once said, "The Alcott girls were society in themselves, and Concord would have been crippled without them." Despite the recent move to Concord, some 16 miles from Boston, in 1858, May's ambition to study art was still going to happen. Writing to her friend Alfred Whitman, who had moved to Kansas after briefly attending school in Concord, Louisa, on October 27th, informed him that Abby is getting her plumage in order for a flight to town where the long talked-of drawing lessons will come off. The youngest Alcott sister was, Louisa told Whitman, quote, "very well and in great spirits about her winter's work and play, has many engagements for skating, dancing, and larking parties already made, and intends to do and enjoy more this winter than any other young woman ever did before." By December, May was rooming with Louisa in Boston and studying art at the School of Design under the Boston artist Stephen Salisbury Tuckerman. 2 years later, in November 1860, a family friend presented May $30 to study art in Boston with Thomas Murphy Johnston, the oldest son of the Boston artist David Claypool Johnston. His son, Thomas, or Tom as he was called, was most known for his crayon portraits, including those of Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Brown. His crayon portrait of May Alcott can be found at Orchard House today, and I also believe it's the frontispiece for the Tickner memoir that was written in the 20s of May Alcott. While May Alcott undoubtedly profited from her studies in portraiture with Johnston, she also knew that paid employment took precedent over art lessons. And she now had an opportunity not only to earn a salary, but also to become more independent. In December 1860, May left Concord for several months to become a drawing teacher and pianist at Dr. Hervey B. Wilbur's Asylum for Children in Syracuse, New York, where her older sister Anna had once taught school. It would be her first extended time away from all of her family. an opportunity to mature and develop as an individual. Writing to her sister, Anna, about May's new employment, Louisa moaned, "What shall I do without her? I'm very glad that she is much liked and so fortunate in all her plans, but her room is so empty, the house so old and still without our lively girl. I cannot bear to think our baby is really a woman, seeking her fortune at last and may never come back little Ab anymore." May wrote Alf Whitman on March 10th about the joy she was experiencing by being on her own in Syracuse. "Oh, Alf, I'm having such a nice time and feel so independent and comfortable." However, her art studies, she felt, were not very productive in New York. "I have some time to draw, although not as much as I should like and had at home, so I've given up the idea of ever being anything of an artist, at least if I decide to make this a permanent home." But Dr. Wilbur's asylum would not be a long-standing position. May Alcott worked in Syracuse only until the summer of 1861 and returned to Concord, as Louisa noted, very tired, but satisfied with her first attempt at being independent. Her youngest sister, Louisa proudly claimed, was quite a belle now and much improved, a tall, blonde lass full of grace and spirit. Not only was May's Syracuse employment her first foray into more independent life away from her family, but it also seemed to mark the 20-year-old's approach into adulthood, a new sense of self. From this point on in her life, May seemed to realize she possessed the talent and the ambition to make her own way in the world. As if to mark this passage, she decided to cast off her childhood moniker for a more mature name. May's decision to be called May instead of Abby perhaps stemmed from her time at Dr. Wilbur's in Syracuse. She informed Whitman in her letter of March 1861, "Please direct to me Miss May Alcott, care of Dr. Wilbur, Syracuse, New York. I'm called May here entirely, as there is another Abby in the town." Well, instead of returning to work at Dr. Wilbur's asylum over the summer break, May, at the onset of the Civil War, had an even better opportunity, as recorded in her journal in May 1861. Being a lucky puss, just as she wants something to do, F.B. Sanborn needs a drawing teacher in his school and offers her the place. Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, Harvard graduate and fervent abolitionist, arrived in Concord in the mid-1850s, becoming friends with the town's illustrious writers. Sanborn operated a private academy in the village center until 1863, just right down the road, where he taught the children of many of the town's leading citizens, including those of Emerson and Hawthorne. His progressive co-educational school prepared students for a college education with courses in Greek, Latin, science, mathematics. But Sanborn also was looking at the whole person, and he offered instruction in music and art and language, and even supported a dramatic association. Helped ease the family's financial cares, always an ongoing issue until Louisa's success with Little Women. But her position also provided May with friendship, social connections, and opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, this paid position served as a validation of her efforts at studying art. May's life in Concord during the 1860s was filled with the activities, the hopes, the desires, I think, of most young women entering adulthood. She was concerned about her future as an artist, but she also enjoyed, loved social engagements, parties, plays, picnics, rowing, skating, croquet. Oh, she was a whiz at croquet. Card games, horseback riding, and a wonderful rider she was. According to Louisa, there wasn't a horse in town that she had not ridden or could not ride. Among her closest friends were the children of Concord's literary. Right? Edward and Ellen Emerson, Julian and Una Hawthorne, George and Horace Mann. May was fond of society, and I walked to and from school dances on cold winter nights, and then be ready next morning for a skating party on Walden Pond, recalled Frank Preston Stearns. An entry from her journal on October 27, 1863, illustrates what life was like for May in Civil War era Concord. Surrounded by good friends and a close family, May Alcott, in the bloodiest summer of the war, seemed almost cut off from the horrors of the violent struggle that raged in the South. At a party that summer evening, she, quote, danced the Lancers with Julian Hawthorne and walked to the arbor in the moonlight, sitting there till supper time. After the evening's festivities, the couple contemplated a romantic row on the river. She writes in her journal, if he had had the boat key in his pocket, we should have gone out on the river, but he could not find it, much to my disappointment. So we agreed solemnly to go next year at this hour, 11 o'clock in the river, supposing we are both living, the weather not to be considered. However, May, in her journal, also confessed her insecurities, her own self-doubt, as she pondered her own future. Probably, Julian will have forgotten the existence of such a person as myself, and I may be very differently situated, although the probability is that today will find me much as I am now. A girl after what is beautiful, some taste for art. Instead of being grateful for a good home, kind, educated parents, devoted sisters, and no brother or husband to be anxious about in the war. In this passage, one senses May's appreciations for her blessings, but also realizes a deeper undercurrent of love for something missing in her life. These periods of inspiration, of attempting to sort out her future life, were often juxtaposed with participation in the public sphere and in larger causes. Despite May's lack of wartime references in her journal, she and Concord citizens were greatly involved in the Union's fight. During the 4 years of the war, Concord women, including May Alcott, participated in their own way as they gathered to sew uniforms, make bandages, supply the soldiers. Concord's Soldiers' Aid Society, with 140 members, worked tirelessly for the troops. In 1962, they were making articles throughout the Union Army. May, like her mother and Louisa, participated in these community activities to support the soldiers. Give you some examples. For example, on November 5th, 1862, May noted in her journal that, quote, she went with Ellen Emerson to the lint pick and did 12 pieces, working from 7:30 to 9:30, which was thought very quick work. The previous night, she had, quote, sewed for contrabands at Mr. Horace Mann's. Again, the following day, November the 6th, May, quote, sewed all day on the machine at Mrs. Mann's for contrabands. During the war years, May also contributed her artwork. And most of this artwork were shells and stones painted with images of Concord scenes. And she would contribute this artwork to the town fairs, most of them sponsored by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, in order to construct an orphanage for black children in Washington, D.C. And she participated in the numerous theatrical performances that were presented in Concord to aid the troops. At first playing piano, but also serving as a prompter for the actors, and then later joining in herself as a performer. Now, what I want all of you to do, all of you who are Concordians out there, is I want you to go home tonight and look in your garages, your attics. And I have never seen a shell or a stone painted with a Concord scene. But there must have been many of them floating around the town, right? So double check, the barn out there, and you say, oh, I never knew what this, you may have a May Alcott original there.
Worth $1 million.
However, despite the ongoing war, May's life went on normally, as it could in Concord. Even in the coldest New England winters would not stop Concord's young people from enjoying their social outings. On the day after Christmas, 1863, May, quote, went skating with Edward and Julian on Walden. They skated all afternoon, quote, till after 5 o'clock. Then all came home in a bunch, singing in a very merry way, Edward and myself leading the party. After having tea at Orchard House, the young folks walked to the home of Mary Peabody Mann near the center of town. There. We each read something on music and then danced Lancers Cotillion and Virginia Reel, having a nice time and coming home by moonlight. Julian's spouting tragedy all the way for my amusement. Julian Hawthorne, later recollecting these times in Concord, declared, I was in love with Abby myself. May Alcott, quote, lovely in form and character, unquote, was, according to Alf Whitman, full of vivacity and fond of all sorts of gaiety. Her oldest sister, Anna, later in 1878, recalled to her family friend that May was always a charming girl, and people were constantly falling in love with her, whether she asked them to do so or not. On October 23rd, 1861, May jokingly wrote to Whitman in Kansas, you also hint sarcastically at my many lovers, all of which I can deny, as I don't think there is a single young man of my acquaintance that cares a pin for me, really. Only they sort of like to flirt and have a good time, and so do I. But I don't think I have a real lover in the world and find myself blooming and happy without them, so don't worry myself. As May's inner thoughts demonstrate, she, unlike many women of her age, 21, she does not appear anxious or worried about dreams of marriage or romance. Almost 2 years later, on August 23rd, 1863, after noting Louisa's success with the recently published hospital sketches, and perhaps longing for a higher purpose in her own life, May confessed in her journal, I wish I had any real talent for anything but flirting. It certainly is an art in its way, and as I am never wicked and malicious about it, I have no prickings of conscience after so an interesting season of this harmless occupation. It's Jane Austen-like, isn't it? However, despite having a circle of friends and neighbors in Concord, May Alcott yearned for closer human connections. On August 23rd, 1863, she confided in her journal, quiet days, but pleasant, as I am more contented than formerly, and so have something in myself to make me happy. I do long for a real, true female friend, a blessing most girls have, but strange to say, I never have known anyone that I could place any great confidence in or that I could love very sincerely. May, perhaps understanding that real strength of character comes from her own inner sense of worth, declared, I should always go to a man with any real grief or trouble if wanting advice rather than a woman, as I think they are always more honorable, upright, and generous. I don't understand why this is, but it seems a real feeling and one to be relied on. I don't say I shouldn't prefer a true male friend, but as platonic attachments are treacherous and no one cares to marry a girl without beauty or wealth, I seem to be left rather to myself, which is perhaps the safest way after all. And if I have any talent to develop, perhaps if I left to myself, I may work out something that will prove I haven't entirely wasted my time and youth. At all events, it's better to try and fail than not try at all, as the proverb says. And I believe firmly in it. This revealing passage, May seems to face her future bravely. Most important, rather than anticipating an early marriage, like many young women in the 1860s, she literally imagines another path. She knows her family possesses no wealth, and she clearly does not think herself beautiful. Thus, with her marriage opportunities perhaps somewhat limited, May realizes that only if she works hard enough on her own to develop her artistic talents will she discover real peace and contentment. On November 9th, 1862, she reflected on her commitment to art. I've done nothing with my pencil for a long time and feel as if I had neglected a duty in not using a crayon certainly once a week. If I was only able, I should like to go on taking lessons of Mr. Johnston, for I think with perseverance I could accomplish something with only the slight talent which I know I possess. A year later, in the fall of 1863, May Alcott began taking anatomical drawing classes from Dr. William Rimmer under the auspices of the Lowell Institute. But the lessons with Rimmer only seemed to increase May's desire to travel to Europe to study. By October 23rd of 1863, she would admit in her journal, "I wish I could satisfy this intense longing to go abroad, as it is almost hopeless to think of it." But hope was on the horizon, and it would come in the form of her own sister. In September 1867, Louisa May Alcott recorded in her journal, "Niles, partner of Roberts, asked me to write a girl's book. Said I'd try." That October, Louisa rented a room in Boston to work undisturbed, and May also began teaching art classes in the city, making the daily commute by train from Concord. As 1868 dawned, Louisa, who had yet to begin her new book, reported in her journal, "May, busy with her drawing classes, of which she has 5 or 6, and the prospect of earning $150 a quarter." During the summer of 1868, May busied herself with teaching art classes, and Louisa worked hard on her girls' book. On September 25th, May wrote Alf Whitman about her busy schedule of work, commuting into the city. "I am up and off in the 7 o'clock train to Boston every day and not home again till 7 at night, with only Sunday to rest, which you see does not leave much time for extras of any sort." Relishing her independence, she assured Whitman, however, that "I enjoy this busy life, Alfred, ever so much, and was never happier than now, for I am determined to make a heap and go abroad in the way I want to." In just over a year, her dream of Europe would be fulfilled. While Louisa May Alcott was unsure of the success of her girl's story, the public, as you know, thought otherwise when Little Women, or Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, appeared in October 1868 with 4 illustrations by May Alcott. The novel was a resounding success, both critically and commercially, and the youngest Alcott sister found herself immortalized as the artistic Amy March, whose modest dream was, quote, "to go to Rome and do fine pictures and be the best artist in the whole world." However, an unpublished letter by Louisa to her editor, Thomas Niles, reveals some interesting facts. And this is the letter that Anka was referring to, Sherry was referring to earlier, which has recently been acquired by the library. And I believe it's also on display right here at the top. So if you haven't looked at it, you can take a look at it. It's really a marvelous letter in all sorts of ways. because there's so very few letters from Louisa documenting both the writing and the publishing of Little Women. This letter reveals to us that May Alcott did not want to be known as the model for Amy March. Alcott writes, Louisa, this is to Thomas Nile, Louisa writes, her editor, "My sister does not want to be identified as one of the Little Women and prefers to have it, the novel's title page, stand illustrated by May Alcott," which is what the final product looks like today. Why did May not want to be known as one of the March sisters? Did she simply think it would be more professional to be listed as the illustrator? That's probably my guess. Or, there's a possibility, does she not want to be identified as Amy, the sister who comes off the worst in the first part of the novel? She's a brat in part one, if you know. Whatever her reason. She did write to Alf Whitman, though, asking him if he recognized the Cyclops in Little Women and that horrid, stupid Amy is something like me when Lou puts a clothespin on her nose. But the horrid, stupid Amy would soon be transformed into a beautiful, vivacious, artistic woman in the novel's sequel. As 1868 drew to a close, the youngest Alcott sister seemed content and happy with her work. Both sisters roomed together in Boston's New Belleville Hotel. Louisa writing away on part 2 of Little Women, and May continuing to conduct art classes. May took great satisfaction in the realization that sacrifices, effort, and dedication were now paying off. In early January of 1869, she reported to Whitman, "I think there's nothing like beginning small and gradually working up to independence, and honestly think there is more real happiness in it than starting with a fortune at command. I used to be so ambitious that I think wealth brought everything, and now I think it an immense power, yet I think the working classes to which I belong, I feel very sure are the happiest." The proletariat. May Alcott, identifying herself as part of the working classes, now was clearly making her own way in the world and feeling more assured in her ability to do so. She seemed to place great value in the act of work, of accomplishing a task with purpose. But May still yearned to be an artist, not just an art teacher. In early 1869, May resumed her studies by taking art lessons with William Morris Hunt. May was indeed fortunate to study with Hunt, arguably Boston's most famous painter at the time, brother of the famous architect Richard Morris Hunt. William, originally from Vermont, traveled to Europe in the 1830s after his father's death, where he studied with the French artist Thomas Couture in Paris. Conducting his classes in Boston's Mercantile Building, Hunt, with his love for European artists, must surely have done much to solidify May Alcott's growing desire to study in Paris. That same year, May began work on her own book, one centered around her hometown of Concord. By autumn 1869, Louisa and May were again boarding in Boston, where Louisa, after the great success that past spring of Little Women Part 2, composed An Old-Fashioned Girl. And May, once again, conducted art lessons for 30 students. The industrious younger Alcott was also working on a series of 12 drawings illustrating various Concord scenes, including idealized depictions of Orchard House, Hillside, and Emerson's home. Perhaps May was hoping to capitalize on Concord's growing literary fame and her close connection to these writers. And in November 1869, Concord Sketches, consisting of 12 photographs from original drawings, was published by Phil's Osgood and Company. And you can see a copy of that also out in the display case there. Louisa contributed a brief preface to the volume, noted that the sketches, quote, from a student's portfolio, were executed as a labor of love, prompted by the natural desire to do honor to one's birthplace. While the book attracted little attention, I mean, only 160 copies were printed, its publication remained an important reminder that May Alcott, despite still being a student, was serious in her goal of becoming an independent professional artist. And that ambition was about to receive a huge boost. In 1870, May's long-awaited dream to travel to Europe finally materialized into reality, and the journey would not only increase her desire to pursue her artistic dreams, but it would also begin to change her ideas about America and her hometown of Concord. Louisa, in her journal, noted, "Alice Bartlett invites May to go abroad with her for a year, and I decide to go as a duenna," sort of a chaperone. Bartlett, 4 years younger than May Alcott, came from a well-to-do Boston family and had visited Europe before, so her experiences would prove useful to the travelers. The journey abroad, which began April 1st, 1870, and yes, Louisa did note that that was a crazy day to start a voyage around to Europe. The whole trip would take 14 months, and the three women traveled through France, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany before arriving in England in summer of 1871. After her first month abroad, May was already expressing some dissatisfaction with her former life in the U.S. "I very much admire the primitive, simple manners and customs of the people here, so much so that our life at home begins to seem a little artificial and unattractive to me." Surrounded by ancient towns and castles and cathedrals, May also came to realize how little she really knew about the world. May Alcott was not an intellectual, but she was intelligent. She was observant. She was curious about life. She told her father, "I do feel, as mother predicted, that I have read very little and know very little, but now that I have time, I study and do what I can to improve my mind." On July 26, her 30th birthday, May, whose professional life had been making significant progress over the last several years, wrote home to her parents and reflected on her newfound thoughts. "I feel quite sure that within the last year or two, my views and opinions about things in general, and a woman's life in particular, have been getting right, and that my real life was beginning. And I think when I come home, Father will find I have grown a little near him, and we shall have some good talks together." May's experience on the European Odyssey, the genesis of what she calls her real life, also had shown her that she could be self-reliant, that she could even possibly live outside of the United States, thousands of miles from her hometown of Concord. She discovered, successfully navigate the cultural and language barriers that Europe would throw at her. She proudly confided to Anna in July of 1870, "I'm quite hardened now and think nothing of poking around strange cities alone." While May remained in England for several months to study art on her own after Louisa returned to America, Anna wrote Alf Whitman in June of 1871 that May is a good girl, full of courage and independence, determined to do something in the world, and a good deal of the fire and energy of the little girl you once knew is there. She's grown into a handsome woman full of grace and dignity and quite a belle in her own little circle. During her sojourn abroad, May Alcott had experienced the fallout from the Franco-Prussian War whirling around her. She had climbed Mount St. Bernard Pass in Switzerland during a raging alpine storm, and she had witnessed the streets of Rome completely flooded for weeks by the Tiber River. May realized that even though she was a woman, she could be strong and independent. Her first trip abroad would only whet her desire to return again and again. In Shawl Strap's Louisa May Alcott's account of a woman's European travels, the author encourages her female readers to come back from Europe a new person. Bring home empty trunks, if you will, but heads full of new and larger ideas. May Alcott returned to Concord with her head crammed and a renewed commitment to her art. May's European experience also helped shape her perception of Concord. in a positive and constructive way. May not only wanted to study and to create art, but she wanted to share with others the creative possibilities that art allowed. Recalling how difficult it had been to maintain her own art studies, May wanted to give others, perhaps those less fortunate even, more opportunities than she had possessed. While studying in England, she wrote home to Concord in 1873 about her dream of exposing more of her fellow citizens to the culture of art. Often, in looking about me here, I feel ashamed and impatient that we, who give so generously to many good causes and spend so lavishly in many foolish ways, are so slow to move in the direction of art. For we need just the culture that alone gives. Not only did May have a larger, more abstract ideas about the benefits of art, but she also devised a practical plan, a way to make art more democratic and less exclusive. I want a really good collection of the best pictures which shall be open to all, not merely to artists or to those who can pay their 50 cents for an hour's lounge, but absolutely free. When we get this in schools such as we find here in Europe, then we need not run away from home and roam about gathering up the advantages of the old world. In June 1875, May Alcott made her dream a reality when she opened the Concord Art Center on the town square. Located in the second story of the old Masonic Hall, you all know exactly where it is, right across, right from the Colonial Inn. Former brick schoolhouse, right where Henry had taught school. The Art Center was comprised of one large room with 8 windows, each equipped with blinds and shutters, which would, as an anonymous article in the Concord Freeman reports, enable us to arrange the light always satisfactorily. At one end of the room was a small stage with remnants of a red canopy inscribed with a Latin motto hanging above it, obviously a relic from the Masonic past. The side walls of the room were lined with small platforms open upon which sculptures could be placed. Easels, desks, and chairs were spread about the open place. Even though some Concordians would sarcastically refer to the center as the Art Academy, the 15 or so people who used it found inspiration and possibility there. Quote, we meet 2 or 3 times a week in mass or in small detachments to work together. The participants, however, did not lose sight of who was responsible for this new opportunity. We cannot fail to enlarge our ideas, at least upon the subject of art, under the guidance and encouragement so heartily tendered by Miss May Alcott, to whose untiring energy and disinterestedness we are indebted for all. Origin of this place, the use of the studio itself, and everything it contains. As Abigail Alcott proudly noted in her final journal, May made great exertions to initiate this art center in Concord, borrowed casts from the School of Technology and loaned her own sketches, her portfolios, and all other accessions to their benefit. Books of value to use with discretion. Hamerton on etching, Ruskin on linear drawing. Another item donated to the center by May was the recently published Talks on Art by her former teacher, William Morris Hunt. I feel proud of my daughter's capability in giving this town so decided an artistic impetus. Not only did May offer her advice, experience, and knowledge to Concord's artists in general, but, as you know, she was always willing to assist them personally. The most well-known of these artists, of course, was the sculptor Daniel Chester French. Growing up in Concord, French, a decade younger than May, had from a young age, quote, been whittling and carving things from wood and gypsum and even turnips. After his father, Henry French, taught with May Alcott about the youth's work, she offered, quote, with her ever-ready enthusiasm, to give French her modeling clay and tools. The sculptor later recalled, I lost no time in harnessing the horse and driving over for them and experimenting with the seductive material, although I didn't even know how to moisten it. Soon after May had ridden her horse Rosa over to the French home to present young Dan with sculpting tools, French's father encountered May Alcott, who, quote, had been over to show Dan the use of tools and was as full of enthusiasm over his efforts as if he were her own brother. May informed Henry French, "I've given Dan all my tools. There's more genius in what he has already done than all I could do in a lifetime." Chester French would never forget May's support, and he would always credit her with helping to ignite his passion for sculpting. Another artist who profited from May's assistance was the sculptor Frank Edwin Elwell, who was born in Concord but orphaned at a young age and raised here by his grandfather, Elisha Farrar, the village blacksmith. Like French, 8 years his senior, Elwell's first art instruction came from his neighbor, May Alcott. Later, Elwell would assist French in his Concord studio before studying art at the school operated by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. In 1881, he traveled to Europe to continue his art studies, a trip which was partially financed by his mentor, Daniel Chester French, and by Louisa May Alcott. Returning to America in 1885, Elwell, whose most well-known sculpture, I think, is Dickens and Little Nell, which sits in the Clark Park in Philadelphia, would go on to teach art at Harvard College, the National Academy of Design, and the Art Student League of New York. And as many of you know, Elwell's bronze bust of Louisa, normally sits right inside the side door of the library, but is now part of the display for Concord Art, which is the Art Museum. Another person, I'm not going to talk about her tonight, that May also influenced was Alicia Keys, right? She also helped her get started with her art career. Louisa's success was something that May always knew gave her opportunities. And just as those artists who would not forget May's help, May never forgot Louisa's help. And she wrote her in 1877 from Paris. "Certainly, dear Lou, you can never be grateful enough that you have been the one who could make dear Mommy and Papa, too, comfortable and happy these last years by your generosity and devotion. For money has done what affection alone could never do, unromantic as it sounds to say so, and you have delighted in making us all happy in our own way, though much of your own life and health has been sacrificed in doing it. And I feel this more than anybody." Louisa's success with Little Women and the works that followed made her wealthy. And as May had experienced, her sister was willing to share that good fortune with her family. Without such financial support, May, as she herself knew, would perhaps never have been able to study art abroad. Living in Europe, May Alcott seemed to find what had been missing in her life: love, commitment, her own pursuit of happiness, her art. We'll never know if May would have returned to Concord to live. So many of the old burdens of care that May had worried about had slowly faded into the past. May Alcott came of age with the Industrial Revolution in America in a way. She hardly knew a world that was not steam-driven. But this modern world had allowed her to live in Concord, yet commute daily, if need be, to Boston to teach drawing classes or pursue her own art studies. She had also been able to journey across the Atlantic to Europe 3 times in a decade. Such a transatlantic life clearly made May more worldly, but she never appeared to forget the values and lessons she had learned back home in Concord. Despite her love of Europe, Concord was May's hometown, and the town had helped nourish her from her young childhood. Growing up in a family where education and art were championed was clearly beneficial, as she had opportunities for more formal education than her younger sisters. Living amidst the intellectual circle of transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, Peabody, all of whom were intimate friends with her parents, surely inspired her own self-reliance. By example, Concord's activism must have also influenced her, especially since her parents and older sister Louisa took an active part in the anti-slavery and temperance movement and later the struggle for women's rights. Upon hearing the news of May Alcott's death in late 1879, Henry French, father of the famous sculptor, wrote to Louisa on February the 1st, 1880. It was May's nature to be generous and unselfish and joyous, and it was more of a loss to Concord than Concord will ever know that your sister could not continue to make the old town her American home. Despite spending her last surviving years in Europe, the youngest Alcott sister was molded from her experiences in a fairly unique Massachusetts village. May Alcott would always be, as Bronson Alcott called her in his 1840 Christmas poem, Concordia's Queen. Thank you. Be happy to take a few questions. I know I've gone just a little bit, past time, but happy to.
How old was she when she passed away?
Well, you would ask me that. Let me think. She's born in 1840. She dies in 1879. That makes her 39. Thank you, class. Good in math. So she was, quite young. It's a sad story, and obviously I did not focus at all on her European years because my focus here was on Concord. Yes, maybe.
Just wonderful talk, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about where the journals are and whether they have this sort of self-scrutiny that seems sort of a transcendentalist ethic, maybe less than Bronson-ish, who only thinks about himself, but maybe not in so, whatever, so thoughtful way.
That's interesting that you could compare it with the family's journals, because if you don't know the Alcotts, they were journalists. Bronson was a big journal writer, collecting, almost, I call them like Bible-size, copies of journals that he would have bound every year. And as you say, you can read 100 pages of his journal and never realize there's a family there. He has a daughter. No, wait a minute, he has two daughters. Her journals, and there aren't that many of them. I can't recall offhand how many, but there are only about 3, I think, sort of extant of the journal. There are a couple during the Civil War periods. There's a later journal that she kept when she was in France. Her journals, for the most part, especially, I think there might be an earlier journal too, if I recall, from the 50s. That one is very sort of, as you would think of a very, how to put it, May was not an intellectual. And the journal, I think, clearly shows that. You do see some moments of self-reflection and that introspection, but not all that much. I mean, it's not every page is filled with sorts. Most of it is filled with the ordinary, I did this today and went to this party, etc. But every now and then she will sort of go, deep into, what's on her mind.
Well, you read some great passages, and thank you.
Thank you. Bob, you have a question?
I just wondered if, as she's living through the Civil War and Reconstruction, she makes many comments about the political world, the social upheaval, the transformation of race relations, or aspire transformation.
Nothing. I say that, and I guess I'm saying it very quickly. If there is something there, it's been a while since I read all of the journals, it's very small. I mean, clearly she knows that there's a war going on, and she's participating in activities, but she never really reflects that much on the war itself. on the reasons why they are fighting. I mean, maybe it's something that she feels so firmly, about that she doesn't even think it's worth it. I don't know. But it is not there, yes.
Is she turning away from her family values?
I would not say so. I think because this is a period of time, she is in her early 20s, right? She's 20 in 1860. I think in many ways she has other things on her mind. And I don't know what we can say about that. I don't know if that, makes her less of an individual or what have you, in the sense that we don't know if she talked about this in her real life. Even most of her letters don't reflect a lot of comments on national activities, unless it's something that actually affected the family, perhaps, or affected the town.
Do you think that when Louisa came home with the illness, that might have brought the war home in a more personal way to May?
Oh, I'm sure it did. I did. And outside of her, and again, there are no journals, if I recall, for those.
Well, there's a little.
There's a little bit.
There's a little bit, yeah. Teasers.
Yeah. I think it did, but she never makes that statement in a
Well, she said it
sense.
to,
Does she?
well, no, I'm just saying, what you're saying is correct, because I noticed in her earliest journals that she had a tendency to, the rest of the family was kind of melodramatic about everything, and particularly Louisa and Abba were very melodramatic about everything, and what I noticed from May was just this kind of, okay, so this happened and this happened. In other words, it was like her normal, and so she didn't make a big deal out of it. Except that there was this beautiful passage about her going to her Aunt Vaughn's baby's funeral at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And it was quite a lengthy reflection about, she was sad, but she said it was beautiful, and her father and her talked about death on the way home, and it was quite extraordinary, and very different from what I would have expected from her.
Yeah. I don't recall that, but you're right. That is unusual, isn't it?
Well,
As
it's
you
like
read her.
there's these little
Yeah.
things that pop up.
Pop up all of a sudden, and you get a good paragraph, or it's.
Yeah, and then you get all this other stuff
Yes.
that's all this mundane stuff,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's fascinating to compare, I think, if you look at the Alcott family, all the journals. I've never thought about that. But the whole family were journal keepers, and so it's interesting. And they're all different type of journal keepers there. Yeah. Well, maybe another person?
One more?
Yes, ma'am.
I've gone to Sleepy Hollow and noticed that a lot of these writers died early, very young. What was the illness that May died of, or if not any others?
Right. May passed away soon after giving birth to her only child, a girl that she named after her sister, Louisa. And I think it was, several weeks later? Six weeks, thank you. Luck speaking in Congress. My understanding is there's been no real definitive, she died of this, but it was, maybe somebody can help me out with the term here, a type of fever that's often associated. Yes.
Cerebral meningitis was one speculation that Madeline Stern had, cerebral meningitis. However, many people speculated, of course, she was in France,
Right.
the records were in French a long time ago.
So a little unclear, but, and would that, I don't know that illness, would that be related or have anything to do?
No, but
That-
it's a fever, it's
It
definitely
is
a
a fever.
fever, yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that May wanted was for her child to be brought up in America. And that's why she asked that the child be given to Louisa, which is mind-boggling when you think of it. You know, the father agrees, and so Lulu, as she was named, comes to America when she is barely just over a year old, perhaps, and stays
Under a year old, she was.
under a year old. Thank you. And she stays until Louisa dies in 1888. And then, as you can imagine, in a way, it's kind of like, oh yeah, you have to go back to Europe now. Not only that, you have to go back and live with a Catholic family and speak a language you don't know. That really must have been hard for Lily to do. Thank you very much.
It's always such a treat to hear Professor Shealy speak. I'm sure all of you could just picture May walking through the streets of Concord, you know, ice skating on Walden Pond and going to those parties and, you know, walking from her home to her friend's home. So thank you for bringing that to life, because it just is so wonderful. Thank you so much. Just right before we leave each other this evening, I did want to make an announcement. The William Monroe Special Collections of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation grew out of the founder and first major benefactor's vision. These collections have become the most comprehensive archive of primary and secondary source material related to Concord history, social and political life, government, culture, literature, people, and landscape. The mission of the William Monroe Special Collections is to collect, preserve, interpret, and share these materials so that we can learn from our past and ensure that these resources are there for future generations to see, study, and enjoy. But we can't do this alone. I am very excited to announce that we will be creating an affinity group called the Monroe Society, which will be dedicated to the preservation and advancement of the William Monroe Special Collections. Members will have opportunities to learn more about the collections through special programs with scholars and archivists to enhance their understanding and appreciation of the collections, support the collections, conservation and preservation efforts, as well as helping us add acquisitions to the collections, such as the Alcott letter revealed here tonight. And 3, serve as ambassadors by promoting and sharing their passion for the collections. If you are interested in learning more about this opportunity, please take the handout that is on the table in the back of the room and fill out the reply card, and then we will be happy to send you more information about it. Leave the card here. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.